His work has been recognized. Oh, okay. Sorry, they were just giving me the message there that was being recorded. I had a little click there. So Martin's work has been recognized in some of the world's most prestigious contests. And most recently in 2021, when he won the Rising Star Portfolio Award in the Wildlife Photographer of the Year contest. It's a pretty big deal, a very big deal. That was hosted by the Natural History Museum in London, England. When Martin offered to do another presentation for us, I took a look at his website and looked through the different projects that he was working on, saw Before They Sink, and thought, well, that sounds like a really interesting topic. And especially right now when climate change is pretty much on top of everybody's list of things they have to be thinking about. And so tonight he's going to take us to French Polynesia, where there seemed to be a lack of Wi-Fi, which is why we're doing our meeting tonight instead of when it was supposed to be. But while he was there, he was documenting one of our most endangered ecosystems. Some of those hundreds of thousands of small islands are just barely above sea level. Warming weather, melting glaciers, rising sea levels are going to probably take some of those islands back under the water again. I hope this presentation is going to have some nice points to it. There'll probably be some wonderful photography, but I'll turn it over to Martin and let him tell us what he saw while he was in French Polynesia and what's happening with those islands. Thanks, Martin. It's great to have you back.
Thank you. It's good to be back. And thank you for moving the presentation. I did not expect Polynesia to have such bad internet and signal and Wi-Fi and everything, but I was unable to do anything. And now not only this, but I'm buried under a mountain of paperwork and emails and all that I haven't been able to attend to in the last month. But good to be here. And I'll since you started with the polar bears, I'll just quickly go back to that a little bit. Because there's an article coming out in the French Geo magazine. It will be about 17 pages long, detailing sort of the expedition we had there. And it should be in June. So for those of you who understand French and are interested in picking up a copy, it will be in the French Geo magazine. And potentially there will be a copy or a segment in National Geographic in July or August, though I don't have confirmation on that just yet. So just some things to look out for in the coming weeks and months. But with that, I'll sort of go into Polynesia. Let me just share my screen here. Sorry, seems to be. Am I still connected? Yeah. Okay. Are we seeing this or no?
We're seeing the two photos.
Okay, we're still seeing that. We had the same issue yesterday, and let me see if I can fix that. Okay, one picture now?
One picture now.
Okay, perfect. All right, so this is an introduction on this project. It's called Before They Sink. It was born in 2018 during my first trip to Polynesia. When we traveled to the Society Islands, which is the main group of islands in French Polynesia that make up this chain. It is the most visited one. This is Bora Bora. I mean, I'm sure most of us have heard about this one island in particular. It is a crazy tourist destination. But while I was there, this project sort of came to mind of let's document the history, the culture of these islands and preserve it. Because as our sea levels are rising, these islands are changing dramatically. And little did I know at the time that climate change wasn't just affecting these islands in the form of rising sea levels, but also in the change of droughts. And one of the islands that we visited was a separate group of islands about 1,300 kilometers north of French Polynesia. It still belongs to the island group called the Marquesas. And it's been a long dream of ours to go to this island, extremely remote. People call it the end of the world, basically. And we were expecting these islands to be lush, green rainforests. And when we got there, it was like the complete opposite. It was more like California than the tropical rainforest. This picture illustrates it, I think, perfectly, because in the background we see those giant peaks that dominate a lot of these islands that are, or the new islands. And on the outskirts, we see a very gray brown landscape that seem to sort of dominate Polynesia right now. And it all has to do with climate change, and it's something we don't really talk about because we talk about rising sea levels. And then you go there and these people, especially in these islands, are not concerned about sea levels, but they're wondering where all the rain went. um, and you know, we're talking a minuscule dot in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that is supposed to collect all the clouds that are around it just because of its height, and that just is failing. You know, these islands aren't collecting as much rain as they used to. These patterns are shifting. um some of the islands we went to, we talked to the local people and they said, you know, 10, 15 years ago, we had seasons. We had the rain season, we had the dry season. Now it's rain during the dry season, dry during the rain season. Um, no one can rely on it. And if you remember me kind of talking about the polar bears and how the thing we found affecting them more than melting sea ice was the unpredictability of the ice. Hearing that sort of tied this into a very global issue because all of a sudden it was the unpredictability that is the immediate threat to these islands, to the people, and potentially to our very own survival, even here in Vancouver, because this is having very global effects. But in any case, that was sort of the broader aspect of this climate change issue that we found out there, and sort of all the more reason why we wanted to document these islands. Now, Elizabeth did say some of these islands barely rise above the surface, and this is the other side of those islands. What you saw, the last picture, was the newest islands. Basically, these are volcanoes that rise up from the seafloor. They look like that very first picture in their freshest state from when they explode. Then that picture of Bora Bora is when these islands start to sink into the ocean and they create a coral reef or atoll around them. And then this right here is sort of the aftermath, is when that center column sinks completely beneath the surface over, 20, 30 million years. And all of a sudden you just have that outer rim. And for a minute, I just want you to look at this and imagine how giant this volcano must have been when it was a mountain. And the sheer force and power of nature when these islands were being born. Because you look at it and you think, we had the explosion in Tonga that I've been following very closely, and you think this was Tonga compared to this was absolutely nothing if you think of the grand scale that formed these islands. A closer look at the same island shelf here is right here. This is that atoll I was talking about, and it's actually Bora Bora in the background there. And this is kind of an interesting thing we found, was a lot of these islands, as the sea levels rise, they're actually rising with the ocean. And it has to do with the coral reefs that these islands are made up of. And as the corals break up, decay, and build more, These islands are slowly rising with that ocean. So a lot of them, you don't really even notice that the sea has risen as much as you would notice it, say, here when you get a tropical storm and you get that surge and all of a sudden, you know, Dunderave or West Van are completely flooded underwater. There you don't really get that. It's sort of pretty mitigated. That being said, you still get a sense sometimes that it is flooding. I mean, these are the coral reefs that I was talking about, that these islands are just built up of along their edge, very much still in their new state of development, with this being the last state of development. This is Mataiva in the Tuamatus in French Polynesia. It is one of the oldest islands, and it is sunk and almost completely closed off from the surrounding landscape, creating these blue pools within that support actually very little life. And it has to do with the temperature. Um, Even when you think about the coral reefs, you have to think that it is a very closed off lagoon that lets in very little water. And it's almost like a closed off ecosystem that's home to, you know, shark nurseries and things like that. I mean, I heard you discussing earlier about the dikes and the salmon here in Vancouver. Very similar aspect here, where you have a very closed off environment that baby animals go, baby fish go to grow and eventually make their way out into the open ocean. So an extremely important environment, but one that again is changing just based on how much water it's getting and things like that. This again, going back, is that sort of shelf that's supporting these islands that you saw from that broader picture, with that sunrise kind of going into it, and seeing just how it is, what it's made up of. You know, we have the coral reefs, years and years. You know, the white on top is actually the newest, and then that black sort of rim around this island was spectacular to see, because it almost looked like fossils, fossilized corals. They weren't really in pieces, but they were just almost fused together, whether it be from when these volcanoes were still exploding and they were covered in ash and lava, and now it has just risen to the surface, or just over time they just settled to it so much that they created a solid surface. Whatever it was, this island only rises about 3 meters above the ocean. And, you know, when we talk about it, you know, rising sea levels 50, 60 meters, 3 meters is not that much. And again, I did say that they are rising with the ocean as the corals decay, but they're just not rising fast enough. And some of these islands are seeing that, some aren't. But again, very interesting to see. But one thing I would note from, and I'll get to this a little bit later when I get to the wildlife factor here, is that these islands have already been so changed by humans. First Polynesians that colonized these islands, and then, you know, white European colonizations that came after that. A lot of these islands support very little animal life. Most of the life is found in the ocean, in the lagoons. But for the most part, there are certain bird species that are surviving, and some are thriving, and some are being protected because of invasive species. But for the most part, these islands are just supporting humans. There isn't really much on them that's left from their original state when they used to support, you know, huge migrations of birds and what various other animals that evolved to live on them. But that's something that has it's not a new trend. These islands have been like that for thousands of years, ever since Polynesians first came to them, and brought, you know, pigs and goats and various other animals that they farmed. But in any case, we go from this very low environment to this environment, which same island chain, but very much in a different state of decay in terms of geographical decay. Here, you know, those columns you see, leftovers of volcanic tunnels made up of different rocks that still rise up from above the ocean. These islands, not 3 meters, 1,500 meters above the ocean. And if you consider how much there is underneath the ocean, you have to consider, okay, you know, similar to Hawaii, where Hawaii, if you would consider the island, it would be the highest mountain in the world, but we don't, because it rises from the seafloor and not from a continental shelf. So again, huge differences. The people on this island, you talk to them and it's kind of funny because they're locals. They know that their seas are rising, and they know they can't really do anything about it because they're such a small nation, and what they do isn't really what's affecting the climate. So they're kind of like, yeah, you know, okay, well, you know, if the sea levels rise, the people from the Tuamatus will come here and all of a sudden we'll be popular. So they kind of, it's an interesting mindset and concept where they're just so cut off from the world that they're not really, they're just trying to survive and live their own life. They're not, and they know they can't really change it. So it's kind of up to us to do that. But yeah, and then in the mountains, tropical rainforest, and then on the coast, you have the palm trees that sort of dominate this environment. And, you know, going back on this island, mostly completely different type of trees and shrubs growing on it. And on the coast, that drought completely affecting that coastal environment where you don't get these palm trees and meadows and a little oasis by the ocean, because that drought just came all the way down to the ocean and dried it up. So completely stark environments. Personally, I love this picture. It's one of my favorite ones, of when the tide comes in and it kind of floods these, not necessarily mangroves, but coconut plantations. It was really amazing to see. But again, going from that into the ocean, this is where most of the life was. I was not fully expecting that, because I was expecting to see at least some, as a wildlife photographer, as a birder, I was hoping to see some sort of life on these islands. But most of it was found in the ocean, and coral reefs that for the most part I found were thriving. You know, even in the 3 years I haven't visited, they haven't changed much, which was actually really nice to see. You saw little pockets of bleaching, but for the most part, they were actually doing really well, which was kind of a surprise considering how hot these lagoons get compared to the open ocean. But again, supporting variety of life. Sharks like this one, you can see it was taken with the drone, sort of patrolling the beach. Funny story, this beach was actually called Shark Beach, and we didn't really think that there would be sharks at Shark Beach, because, you know, you go to these places all around the world that are named after some animal, and that animal hasn't been there in years. And then you go to Shark Beach and sure enough, there's sharks. So it was really cool to see them sort of patrolling the coastline. And then in this one, not necessarily any animals here, but this is the pass into these archipelagos. So what they are is they're made up of a sort of, you can think of it as a shell around, and then each one of them, for the most part, except with the one with the lagoons, has a very small pass that goes into it. And this pass lets in all the water at high tide and then lets it out at low tide. And this is where you get most of that life. And I found this part extremely amazing because you don't even see it with the drone here, but beneath the water here is one of the largest concentrations of sharks in the world. These two islands, Rangiroa and Fakarava, are the best diving spots for sharks because the Polynesian government and the people of Polynesia have set aside a no fishing zone, and there's absolutely no fishing or commercial fishing around these islands. And it has created a complete oasis where you can dive here and you can go underneath the water and see what this world looked like, hundreds of years ago, because there is just that much marine life in the water. For instance, manta rays. You can see all of those things sparkling in the water are little fish. Again, I was like, this was, for me, it was amazing to see, because this was just from shore. We were watching on one of those islands with the high cliffs. We were watching 7 manta rays about 100 meters from the coast, swimming in the water, doing flips as they feed on plankton amongst the fish. And it was quite spectacular to see. I wish I could have gotten in the water. I was just using the drone to take the pictures and take the videos. But when I did get in the water, it was mostly with smaller fish like here. And this sort of illustrates just how rich that life is underneath the water. You saw that drone shot with the deep blue contrast to the light blue, and then you go into the water and you see just how much life there is in it. In the background, there's is Bora Bora that you saw in the very first picture, and then just amazing amounts of fish and marine life, and again doing very well, because again, these people, they know they can't really change anything because their lifestyle isn't going to change their climate, but they know they can do something, and they're protecting what they can, and they're protecting their oceans. Some of these islands are protecting themselves from rats. You may know that that is a huge problem in the South Pacific, whether it be Polynesia, New Zealand. All of these islands, over millennia, as they have evolved various bird and animal species that are very specific to that one location. Birds in the Marquesas cannot be found anywhere else in the world but in the Marquesas, because they're so isolated and they have evolved to be there. As such, they're prone to these foreign rats and invasive species. And some of these islands are doing something about it. They're getting rid of the rats. Some of them haven't even had the rats yet, so they have very strict rules and regulations for when boats come. You can't dock. You have to wait for a dog to come on your boat and search it, and then you can dock. So really amazing to see that is something that they are capable of doing and sticking to it. So outside of fish, we have stingrays, which are quite literally everywhere in the shallows, in those sandbanks, especially on those islands that are in the middle stage of decomposition, where you still have that giant mountain in the middle and that beautiful atoll around it. And once you get into the blue, you have those sharks that I mentioned earlier. This quite literally being just a very small speck of the population. But as soon as you get in the water, you're basically within them. And very interesting to see, considering, I grew up, my family are in the movie industry. They love Jaws, and these movies, used to grow up with it, watching it as a kid. So watching that, and then all of a sudden jumping in the ocean and seeing hundreds of sharks around you, sort of gets the blood pumping for sure. But again, once you're in it, and the same way I live with polar bears, knowing what you're doing, you find out that these animals aren't actually quite as dangerous as they're made out to be, and they're actually quite amazing. For instance, this is from above the water, a lemon shark, as opposed to the other ones, which were blacktip reef sharks. And then particularly, this is one of my favorite pictures from
I can see that, yeah.
from the underwater world. It was tip reef shark patrolling a coral reef in Rangiroa, the picture you saw again with that deep blue. And like, I just love this picture because you really see the colors in the coral reef, that the coral reef is actually doing really well, but partially because of these sharks, because they're getting rid of predators, and has a, how even on land, protecting the predators has a cascade effect on the entire ecosystem. Protecting the sharks here had a cascading effect on the coral reefs, where they're actually healthy, even though they are very much stressed into this, facing all these challenges. But yeah, for this picture, I knew this shark was kind of patrolling the water, and he kind of surprised me because I was looking at some little fish in the coral reef, and then I just look up and he's kind of right in front of me and goes back. And my dad made a joke saying the shark came because I scratched my leg on a reef. But again, really cool to see. And as soon as you leave the safety of that coral reef, you get a wide variety of marine mammals, which are dolphins. Certain season, you get humpback whales migrating from Antarctica. These were spinner dolphins coming to look at our boat when we were sailing between these islands. Funny enough, actually, to get to some of these islands is extremely remote. Over COVID, they actually canceled airlines. So to some of them, you actually need to get a helicopter, which is partially funded by the government, because the helicopter is the only way these people can get to the grocery store. So that's their main source of transport on some of them. To this particular island, it was a boat. It took 3 hours, but because they had a broken engine that no one seemed to mind, it took 5. And I do work on the ocean, but I do get extremely seasick. And I did forget my motion sickness pills at home. So going there, I was completely dead. I was just in the side of the boat. I won't even explain to you what was going on, but I was very excited after 5 hours to get off this boat, knowing that I still have to go back. I was quite sad. Luckily, the people living or accommodating us had seasickness pills, which I don't speak French, but somehow I explained to them that I need seasickness pills, and they managed to get me some. So on the way back, I felt much better enough that I actually was on the deck looking for dolphins, and surely enough, they were there. So I was just thinking when I was on the boat, like, oh, these guys must have been here when I was feeling sick going over there. I was just too sick to go take pictures. And going back, we saw them multiple times. So that was quite beautiful to see. And then, of course, I'm sure everyone would love to see some birds. This is the most common bird species that we found in Polynesia. This was actually on one of the islands or atolls we visited. And the chick completely and the mom completely uncaring of the people around them. I mean, this chick was literally on a tree branch right above where our camp was, where we were having dinner. So again, the birds, even, they're not really familiar with people, or they are, but they aren't scared of them enough as you would see potentially in other areas in North America or on the mainland. So very beautiful to see. I love this picture. One of the few that I've actually managed to see from these islands. But funny enough, very common bird again in Polynesia, and actually a similar species we found in the Indian Ocean. When I was a kid, we went to Seychelles in Africa, and I remember my dad photographing this bird as a kid on one of the bird islands there. So it was nice to sort of see that and see them on these islands as well, and being so tamed around people. Another bird, blue-footed boobies, and various other albatross and booby species on this particular island. This was Mataiva, the one I explained with the lagoons. birds on these islands tend to be on the last islands where civilization is. Obviously, it's kind of their last stronghold. On this island, they weren't so much on the atoll itself where they usually used to be. They were sort of confined to two smaller islands in the middle of the lagoon, and they both had a pretty thriving bird population. Excuse me. Excuse me. They both had a pretty thriving bird population, which was, again, really cool to see that these birds were surviving and adapting and weren't in particular threat, even despite all the invasive species that are around them. Now, I wish I had more birds to share with you. Unfortunately, that was pretty much the extent of the wildlife we saw on land. But there's a lot more wildlife to see. You know, these mountain ranges, you see a little road here. This pretty much went to that house that you see down there, and that's the extent of it. So as remote as these islands are, and as populated as they are around the edge, the mountains in the middle remain largely unexplored, largely secluded from the outside world. So as much as we know what's there, little do we know what's there, and perhaps there are other thriving bird species and animal populations within them. Like in here, we actually went for a hike into one of these canyons, not on this island, but a similar one, and it kind of felt like you were going into Jurassic Park, because you're walking into this canyon with giant steep walls around you to a waterfall, and all of a sudden it's an ecosystem within an ecosystem. Of you have this huge rainforest on the outside, and then you cross a corner and all of a sudden you have completely different vegetation, completely different bird species just living in this one secluded valley away from the entire world. And that was beautiful, just from all of these islands. And that's not necessarily something that's going anywhere, because it was well above sorry, I'm just gonna my apologies. This is why I usually do my meetings in my room. Sorry about that. Anyways, so these were the sort of safe havens within the mountains, and then here you can see the sort of populated coastlines where you have sort of civilizations. A person's dock here, barely see the mountains in the background, but again, the atolls and sort of that middle ground, people just being and colonizing where it's flat and where they're actually able to live, as you know, with other parts of the world. And then of course some islands within these islands being just, you know, big enough for 4 palm trees. And you'd be surprised, but that little island on some of these was the safe haven for those birds, just because, you know, by colonizing that outer edge of these islands, we've kind of pushed them to go to these lengths to stay away from people. Unfortunate to see, but also interesting in the sense that a lot of these islands are made up of thousands of little islands just like this. So, you know, still a very viable bird population or an animal population living there. You have just on this little speck of land, you know, coconut crabs, various other crab species burrowing into the sand, as well as birds and other wildlife. So very much different from what we would be used to seeing these animals in a rainforest, sort of say. And again, here, sort of going back to that theme of the little docks, you just see the huge amounts of fishing boats and various other docks. This is how actually the Polynesians keep their boats. They don't have docks as we do in Canada. They have a little pulleys and pillars where they sort of park their boat inside, as you can see in some of these pictures. And they park their boat in there, they pull it up, and then they swim to shore. very much different and sort of simpler to sort of what we're used to seeing here, where you'd have a giant dock with 3 boats and you walk up there and that's how you get. No, these people are living a much simpler life, and they didn't. We were kind of surprised sometimes when there was a storm going on and a fisherman came with all his stuff and 3 bags and a salmon, or sorry, a tuna, threw it over his shoulder and then waded through the water just to get home. So very much different compared to what we're used to seeing here. But the water being sort of the only way you can explore these islands, just because again you can't get into those mountains very easily. It is a rainforest that it's pretty much impenetrable. So to explore it, we used boats, canoes, kayaks. This was actually taken in 2018. We went over Christmas, and this was actually my birthday, at 4 in the morning. Probably one of the best birthdays I've had, because I got to be completely alone. I took the kayak and I went into one of these estuaries, and from the air, from the ground, or sorry, from the water, not necessarily looking like there is sorry, allergies. Not looking like there is a tremendous amount of life, but then going with the drone above, you can just see all those coral reefs, the sand. If you look closely enough, you can see various fish within the corals. Personally, I love this picture just based on how much you can see if you really dig deep enough, especially in the blues towards the bottom. You see little shapes and shadows, all of them being little fish living inside. And then moving further out from the very same environment, you get to really see those levels of in the same way you have the mountains, you have these mountains in the water, and you really get to see those different shelves and depths that this ocean goes, even just in the lagoons, again supporting all that marine life that you saw earlier, just because of those upwellings coming up on these sandbars, mostly where you would find those animals. The picture of the ray that you saw earlier was taken just along the edge of this sandbar going into another sandbar. But again, from the aerial perspective, looking like not much is there, but as soon as you get in the water, you see that huge variety of fish and various other animals. So for the most part, we found that these islands were very much secluded. The people there the number hasn't really changed for the most part. Some of these islands have a population of 600 people. Some of them have a population of 2,000 people. Bora Bora being one of the only ones that is really being developed into a tourist destination. We're used to seeing those various bungalows above the water. This is a project that was happening when we were there, of them building new bungalows. That's maybe, Bora Bora, for instance, wasn't an island where we found so much marine life. This could be the reason. You see them really building these bungalows right on the coral reefs. Again, there's really no space on land to build anymore, so most of these resorts are pushing to go out on the water. They don't need the same permits, they don't need the same licenses to build on the water as they do on land. So you really see this world expanding into the ocean. Luckily, it's only happening in Bora, so the other islands are still very much wild, but it'll be interesting to see over the years what effects these developments will have on that marine life, and what all these tourists will have, all these extra boats, planes, all that flying to these islands, what effects it will have on the natural world. I'm curious to find out. That was one of the reasons why we started this project, was to not just document the islands in their current state, but to also document them over a larger amount of time and see how they've just changed in our lifetime. Because 50, or not even 50, 20 years ago, this was one of those resorts on one of these islands, now sitting completely abandoned. Once upon a time, this pool probably being one of those luxury pools people paid $500 a night to be by, and the expansion there on the water just being remnants of what used to be bungalows or potentially a project that never got built. Um, so you really see this in large amounts of these islands where families move away, people move out, and this land sitting completely vacant, no one really knowing who it belongs to, and just sitting there undeveloped or developed and sort of being recolonized by the natural world. And for the most part, the natural world succeeding in recolonizing it in a very short amount of time. Um, uh, I talk about all the people. These are the Polynesian people in Tahiti. Again, mostly kids, not so much adults, as much as you see kids and living a completely different world than the kids living here. You know, you talked earlier about the kids collecting snakes and things like that. These kids not collecting necessarily snakes, but living on the streets, living in the natural world. Most of these places don't have signal, so they can't have their phones to play with, video games and whatnot. Living very differently from what we are living. And we actually met a few people documenting specifically the young generation of Marquesans, Polynesians, different cultures, and what effects Western society is having on them, because they grow up seeing the movies we see and sort of thinking of the American dream, but being stranded on these islands. And for the most part, you actually see them having families, running family businesses, not even necessarily leaving these islands. So for the most part, they're quite happy with what they have there, and that was cool to see, because it's a much simpler life than what we have. You know, they don't necessarily go to work and do a 9 to 5, and even people that have moved there from France and other parts of Western society say that, and they say, you know, in France, I used to pay taxes and do this. Here, they don't have taxes, and they're living a much simpler world where, you know, you work, you have money, you can afford things. You don't work, you don't have money, you can't afford things. It's a much simpler mindset than sort of the one we're being brought up in. And that was very interesting, how that was working there. Going back again to sort of nature recolonizing these islands, you can see a road being taken over here, used to lead to a house that is no longer there, sort of nature taking care of it. And sort of the night landscape, I haven't talked about that. Um, Due to their remoteness, that's actually a shooting star in the picture there. You see a tremendous amount of stars, and it's, you go outside without and on a new moon, and you can still see almost everything around you, just because there are so many stars in the sky. So that was really beautiful to see, that there's still places in the world where we can go and see um, not just the natural world, but sort of look up in the sky and think that the world once looked like this everywhere, and sort of just sitting in a chair looking in the sky and just thinking about that, and especially on these islands, and thinking how they were born. And there was just something extremely magical about it. So if you ever get a chance to to visit these parts of the world, I highly recommend staying up one night and just sitting and watching the stars, because you know, we take it for granted here living when there's so much light around you. There, it's just unbelievable. But yeah, so that's pretty much the scope of this project and what we were doing. I'll talk a little bit more about tying it back to sort of the droughts and the rains. Because again, that was the main. We thought we would see rising sea levels, and we saw droughts, which was something mind-boggling, something completely unexpected. But it is part of the Polynesian, or sorry, South Pacific, where you have these huge mountains rising into the sky, and they collect all of this rainfall, and then you know you see how much it rains by looking at the mountains. Here we see one waterfall, but if you look at the mountain behind it in closer detail, you see hundreds of channels dug into the mountainside. And I was talking to some locals, and when it is the rain season, for about 45 minutes, the mountain is just one entire waterfall, and that's throughout the South Pacific on these islands where there are mountain ranges. You get that downpour like we've been getting here with the atmospheric rivers. You get that one downpour, it rains, everything turns into a river. The island all of a sudden is underwater, even though it is on a mountain. And after 45 minutes, it's sunny. After an hour, the water is gone, and you have one waterfall again. So it's crazy to think that, and that again, how these animals have adapted to sort of live within that landscape, um, and the plants adapting to funnel water certain ways and absorb as much water as they can. It was quite beautiful to see. Of course, various flower species and plants colonizing this world through the water. I actually read something really interesting today, which you might find interesting, and that's that the fern species on these islands found in these mountains um, are the same fern species that they discovered in fossil records in Antarctica. And that sort of gives you a time frame of how old these islands actually are. When you think about it, that the ferns there used to once be in Antarctica, and Antarctica is now under ice. um, Perhaps Antarctica one day will once again be green, and the same fern species will once again be found there. We don't know, but that sort of puts it into perspective that even though the sea levels will rise, once they were high, and these islands were not at all looking like they are now. They were perhaps covered underwater, but parts of them were still above water. And as the seas went down, as the ice age came, the nature simply just colonized down with them, and now it's doing the opposite, and nature is climbing back up into the mountains as the ocean rises. So that was you know again, nature is adapting, and we can do a book called Before They Sink. But in our minds, we can call it that because it is before they sink, and one day perhaps they will be underwater, some of them, unfortunately. We can slow that process down, but ultimately, looking at it, it is sort of the natural process of the world, and these islands have been living with that and adapting to that for millions of years, way before we had any effect on it. So that was just something that struck me, because it wasn't something I went there thinking about, but listening to the people and figuring out sort of more into the past of these islands, it was very interesting to see. So yeah, that sort of covers this presentation of Before They Sink. I don't know how much time we have, but if anyone has any questions, I would love to hear them.
I have a question.
Yes.
First of all, a wonderful presentation, fantastic photography, by the way. My question is, what kind of animals live in the mountains and in the rainforest? Is there any primates or anything that big?
Yeah, actually, because if you think about how these islands were colonized by nature, it's very much on the scope of New Zealand. They are so remote that everything that got there had to either float or fly. So you don't really have any primates. You don't really have, if you take away the animals we brought there, the only animal you would find are birds and crabs, because crabs colonize through coconuts and various plants floating across the Pacific, and birds colonize these islands through air currents. And you don't really realize how windy it is until you step up on top of one of those mountains. And we did at one point, and you almost get blown away. And that just, at the bottom, you have no wind whatsoever, and you step on that mountain and it's a hurricane. And that really explains how these islands were colonized by birds, by plants. Because all of a sudden, just on the very peaks, you have ferns growing. And if you think how ferns grow and propagate, they have spores, which are very miniature, and they basically, plant themselves on the top of the mountain, release it into the wind, and then that can travel, thousands and thousands of kilometers, that spore, and colonize an island in Hawaii. And then you see it in real life, and you're like, okay, well, this is how these islands were born. And it was fascinating. So no primates, mostly just birds and various plant species.
Thank you, Martin. That was really very, very interesting. Not exactly what I was expecting, and some of it was a lot better. Lovely to see that the corals are still surviving. And it's interesting to know that the people there are just adapting to most of the stuff that's happening. Though I certainly have seen some documentaries showing where it's not rising seas, it's just storms.
Yeah.
That are way more severe than they normally have. That are taking huge waves up across the islands, and the salt water, of course, is killing all their crops and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and failing completely in some instances. But yeah, it's funny because when you and I first discussed this presentation, I was thinking, okay, what scope do I want to approach? Because there's so many. And then it fits so well, and that's why I love that this presentation fit literally after I got back, because it's so fresh in my mind, and the memories and all of that information is just, I'm still trying to absorb it. I got back, I took with my father 30,000 pictures while we were there over the last month. I've seen the ones I showed you today. That's pretty much the extent of the pictures that I managed to piece together. But yeah.
Well, I can imagine it would have been lots to photograph. And I see we have a question here from Val Fuller, otherwise known as Molly. What was the bird species in the picture of the adult feeding the baby a fish? I was wondering the same thing.
I would love to tell you, and I can't because I don't know.
Well, okay, so Colin and Stephanie are telling us it's maybe a fairy tern?
It could. There were fairy terns on various islands, and I did see them. It did not look like one specifically, just because when they fly, they and I was told the name in French, and unfortunately I can't remember it. But when they fly, they have the prettiest white tail with two almost like a tern, but much, much longer, and they don't really behave like terns. So it could be a tern species. If you would like, I can do some digging, and I can send you an email, and you can let everyone know what it was called, because I would love to know. And
I'd like to know what it was too. I was looking and thinking, I don't know what that bird is.
I didn't want to, knowing that you guys are very much interested in bird species, I didn't want to call out a name and then get told at the end of the presentation that that's not that, so I just avoided the subject.
But anyone that's still on here know what that bird is for sure.
It reminded me of a tropic bird. That was what my guess was, that it was a tropic bird.
I can bring it back. Oh, sorry, too far. My computer is slower than. There we go. I can do some real quick digging and find out.
The tail is not that long, is it?
They had there was two. Oh, I found it right here. It is a. Hold on one second. My apologies. uh, well, they don't tell me what the name is. Common white tern.
Wow.
Good turn.
Hmm.
It's
And
beautiful.
they were extremely common along especially these islands that we saw. There were various other, they're called fruit doves, that are also not common. They're actually quite rare, but again, a very beautiful bird. Not as gray and brown as the doves we're used to. This dove is actually green feathers and a yellow belly with kind of a lighter green colored head. A very beautiful bird, and one I found was pretty rare to these islands, but mostly just found on these islands.
That thing is beautiful.
Martin, I have a question about the changing in temperatures. Rising sea levels are one thing, and then changing of sea temperatures are another. And I just wondered if there had been, if you had got any evidence from, the last 25 years or so about species that were fish or sea life that were new to this area or had vanished from this area to be replaced by others because of sea temperatures.
For the most part, I don't have like much information on like new colonizing animals, but for the or marine life, for the most part, the general consensus in French Polynesia is that it's staying pretty much the way it was in terms of the animals that are found there, or the sea life that is found there. The only difference being that there is double or triple the amount that there used to be there. And that is largely due to the fact that the Polynesian government has implemented those no fishing zones around these islands to protect them. And, whether that has effects on these ecosystems just being stronger and less prone to invasive species, I don't know, but that is one of the main factors in these islands, is that the local population of marine life is growing, and as such, the foreign animal or sea populations aren't as noticeable, if any.
That's really interesting, I find, because, most places in the world where you go and speak to fishermen, generally there are tales. 25 years ago, we were getting this fish, or 40 years ago, these fish were really common. Now we don't see them, not necessarily because of overfishing, but because, of changing temperatures and they've moved elsewhere. So that's really interesting to hear that about these islands.
Yeah, it's quite the opposite there. There are exceptions, like the Marquesas where we went, which are very much remote. They're 1,500 kilometers from the main island group, so a lot less resources go into protecting them and patrolling those waters. In the Tuamatus, where all the sharks are, you have police and fisheries and various other organizations protecting the water. In the Marquesas, you don't really get that, and all of a sudden you get when you talk to the locals, and they say, "Oh, you say, oh, this is a wonderful tuna," and they're like, "Yeah, I don't know how much longer we will have tuna," and you talk to them like, "Why?" And they're like, "Well, our water is protected, but there aren't enough of us to protect it, and the Chinese fishermen come in and they're taking all the tuna." So the island groups that are populated, that have a tourism resource, which is interesting because the ones that have all the tourism have all of these resources to protect that resource, have that wildlife, but the ones on the outer edges are seeing some sort of struggle in a decline, sort of say.
So the stability of the types of fish or sea life that is available, it's very stable, but it could be affected by fishing policies rather than climate change.
Yeah, very much so. And that would be the main factor to these islands and to this ocean in this part of the world. It won't necessarily be so much affected by climate change as it will be by policies and politicians and foreign fishing vessels.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. It was a great presentation.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, I did.
I have another question, if I may. The picture you showed of the reef looked a bit bleached. Is that the case, or is it?
Is that the picture you were mentioning, like the half and half one, or?
Oh, you showed a picture of the reef underwater with the shark and the
Oh, yeah.
trumpet fish, and it looked a bit bleached because the colors aren't as vibrant as you would expect on the Barrier Reef or in Hawaii. I was
These
wondering if that's occurring there.
I did notice some signs of it in very select places. It wasn't to the scale of like the Great Barrier Reef where you have giant swaths of reef just turning white.
Oh.
This instances, it was particularly just spots and dots. But to a larger, like I haven't snorkeled or dived in the Great Barrier Reef, so I can't speak on the colors of that. But around these islands, I think the reefs that are found there are also different, just based on the fact that the water in these lagoons is extremely hot. So I think the species there have adapted to that environment. I'm not a scientist. I can't speak on that behalf. And that's maybe just a theory from going to these areas. But potentially, I think that might also be the case. And not to say that it isn't bleaching, because it is in certain areas. But yeah.
Does anyone else have questions? No?
Cool.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much, Martin. It was very, very interesting. Lovely photography as always. And,
No worries. Thank you for having me. As again, it was lovely to present to you, and thank you for being so accommodating and being able to move your time and move this meeting, because again, I know we had a different time lined up, and unfortunately that just never ended up working out. So I appreciate that very much.
That's no problem.